Populism is one of these protean words that can mean just about anything anybody wants. And it is often used as a term of derision. To say that a politician is a populist is another way of saying that the politician is a demagogue. Or to say that a movement is populist is to say that it has no clearly worked out solutions, it merely articulates grievances. Perhaps, and it is certainly true that populism today in much of the West is born out of protests. And I'd like to talk about, I think, a third dimension. We mentioned already the two dimensions that get the most attention, that populism is in the first place a protest against economic changes. If you look at the way much of the West worked 20, 25 years ago, the average person had more or less secure a job for life, slowly rising wages as individuals became more senior and also as the economy grew. It seemed to be safe, and there was pretty good generational mobility. That is, the children of workers often ended up in professional occupations and so on. That way of life seems to be endangered or disappearing in many countries, and so naturally there is a protest movement about that. The second element that is in the sort of conventional diagnosis is that populism is a movement born out of cultural protest, the feeling that one's identity is under threat, whether it's through cultural change, as sort of, quote, metropolitan and cosmopolitan, unquote, values, challenge long-established folk customs and ways in many countries, or alternatively as immigrants begin to change the fabric of daily life and take an almost homogeneous or relatively homogeneous population and add new elements. And there's a sense of being displaced and even perhaps under threat. Now, I will say that one of the strangest, I think when historians look back at this era, they will be astonished that anyone could have been as stupid as we've been. The sense that the last 200 years of European history have been, in large part, wars of extermination and expulsion as ethnically homogeneous nation states were founded out of the ruins of cosmopolitan empires. And certainly the long struggles between Greeks and Turks are one of the very dramatic examples of this. And this drive for ethnic homogeneity, for a nation state that reflects the culture of a particular people and language, has been the most powerful force in European history for generations, and yet apparently we just have all assumed that, okay, that's over now. We will not have that anymore. There is simply, we can bring unprecedented waves of immigration into Europe and not expect trouble. Well, that was stupid, and here we have the trouble. That doesn't mean that I want to stand for a kind of a xenophobic attitude toward immigrants, but it's a simple piece of political reality that this was an inevitable result, and now we are reaping the rewards of our lack of foresight. But I think there's something else, a third dimension to populism that may ultimately be more serious and is much less frequently mentioned or analyzed. What is that? It's a loss of power. Increasingly, many average people, voters, feel that the state seems less interested in their problems, elites seem less oriented to their values or their needs. And this is a real thing. This is not an imagination. If we look at the history of how average people, the ordinary citizen, gained power in the Western world, we see several trends. One is that states needed universal military service in order to provide the mass armies of warfare from the time of Napoleon right up through the Cold War. And when you when you have to go call young men from every family and every part of your territory into the army, you both tie yourself more tightly to the community. You need their political support in order to do this, but you've also you've trained the population in the use of arms and force. And you can look and see that many of the reforms and changes and political shifts of power in the Western world were very much related to the increased dependency of states on their citizens to fight their wars. The second dimension of this was the power of the industrial working class. That is, as the working class unionized and organized, working people had the power to shut the country down. If the coal miners went on strike, Britain would freeze. If the railroad workers went on strike, the entire economy would grind to a halt. This is both of these things are less and less true. States simply do not need universal conscription in the old way, and states also, and the industrial working class is in disarray. It is less powerful than it used to be. Conditions change from country to country, but it is actually unusual today to live in a country where union leaders can actually bring the economy to a juddering halt. So the masses have lost real power to the classes. This is a fact of life in our societies today. And what I think you can see in populism is the masses trying to equalize the situation by relying on the tools that still remain to them. The election of Trump, in some ways in the United States, you can look at it as a kind of, the electoral counterpart to a strike. They were presented in Hillary Clinton with a candidate who had all of the requirements that an establishment candidate should have: experience, contacts, what we would call a safe pair of hands, and they simply refused to vote for her in sufficient numbers for her to win the electoral vote. And many of the people, if you look at the approval ratings for Donald Trump, he was not popular on election day. Many of the people who voted for him did not think he was qualified to be president of the United States. It was a vote against as much as it was a vote for. And it's a bit more troubling because Senator Clinton, Secretary Clinton, I think is in many ways a very good example of the American establishment, and someone who has tried in her way to be public-spirited, who certainly has had a lot of experience in government and politics. And the fact that she was rejected tells us that at least a significant section of the public would rather be ruled by someone who didn't know what he was doing rather than by someone who brought all the skills and attitudes that govern the political establishment of the United States. So,
Professor Mead, just one more minute, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Populism, then, we have to see not simply as the sullen anger of a working class that is watching its wages decline, people who've been left behind. It's more than simply xenophobia or a desire for the good old days to come back. It is also the first step, in any case, in a serious movement to try to correct the balance of power between elites and the masses, a balance of power which in recent decades has shifted decisively toward the elite and away from the mass of the people.